seminar with Anna Korteweg and Janine de Hinden. And excuse me, Janine, for anglicizing, and you too, emphasize for anglicizing your name. I thought about asking the correct pronunciation, but then I would just embarrass myself even more by getting the correct pronunciation wrong. So, so you're Janine tonight, and you're Anna, welcome to the Ethnicity Center as well. So just by way of brief introduction, Janine is a professor of transnational studies at the University of Neuchatel in Switzerland, where she studies migration, mobility, transnationalism, and how those things and other things contribute to the production and reproduction of various types of inequalities. Anna is a professor of sociology at the University of Toronto in the Department of Sociology, and she does work on the intersectional critique of integration, working empirically in Canada and in Europe as well on things like honor-based violence. She's written a book on the headscarf, and lots of other things. So they both published too many things. That gives me a good reason not to kind of go through a long list of things. You can look at their websites. Really, really interesting people. And, you know, so the kind of, I feel like when I give this introduction, you get these sorts of, you know, things we're all familiar with, particularly in the Ethnicity Center: transnationalism, migration, mobility, intersectionality, integration, all these kinds of terms that we're familiar with. But you're going to get something different from Anna and Janine tonight, or you will get something different from them. I mean, I think they really, I mean, they both inspired me in my work separately and now together, which is even better. And they take a very critical approach to the topics, of interrogating some of the very fundamental questions. I mean, Janine's work on migration and transnationalism has really kind of called into question how we use these terms and the effect that that has. And Anna has done similar work on integration, which is where my interest is at the moment. So it looks, you know, on the face of it, it may look rather conventional, but there's nothing conventional in what you'll hear and see in their work. And so really kind of original thinkers. So it's really a pleasure to have both of them here this evening. They are going to talk about culture as politics and migration and the invisibilization of power. So it's a co-production here, and they're going to do a little bit of back and forth and stuff. So I will just hand the floor over to them. Stick around for, so they have about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, however much time they really want. And when they get to the end of the talk, then we'll open the floor to questions and comments and conversation from all of those who are here. And I think you can do that by putting questions in the chat if you'd like, but I think there are a few of us here that at the moment, so that you can also just raise your hand and turn on your camera and voice your question as well. So without further ado, I will give the floor over to Janine and Anna.
All right, so I'm going to get us started, and Janine will go next, and then I'll go again, and then Janine will go again. We're going to kind of hand over the baton. But before I launch into our talk, I do want to thank you, John, and also Bridget, for inviting us, John, for this really generous introduction. You made me blush. And also to Johan for all the help she provided in getting us organized and making sure the bios we gave you weren't like 600 words long. Okay, we are very excited to present a paper today that Janine and I have been working on for a couple of years now. I think somebody has their mic on. Can everybody make sure they're muted? Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we're good now. Thanks so much. Sorry, I was like, I keep thinking like somebody's calling me and it's a bit distracting. So how did this paper that we're presenting to you today come about? Well, Janine had invited me to Neuchatel already once before for a workshop, and then again to be on the committee of her PhD student for the defense. And now Dr. Faten Kazé, who is, I believe, in London, a brilliant student, and we had so much fun during the defense. And then we took the train back to Zurich, where Janine is actually zooming in from today. And on the train ride, we started talking about culture. And I was like, well, I think there's some utility to it. And Janine was like, not so sure. And then it was like, well, I teach a course on it. I'm going to teach a course on it. And Janine, I'm also teaching a course on it. And then we started talking about how could we integrate our teaching and do a research project on the meanings and utility of the concept of culture. So we ended up, and this was in the summer of 2019, pre-COVID days. We were both teaching in the early 2020. And so Janine came to my class to talk about Switzerland and politics of culture in Switzerland. And I unfortunately had to Zoom in because by the time it was my turn, lockdowns were in effect, but still we had a lot of fun talking. And then we also invited our students to interview each other if they wanted for final projects, which some of them took us up on. But most importantly for what we're doing today is we ended up asking the students right at the start of the class to write a short essay on the meaning of culture. And it's that data that is the foundation for what we're presenting to you today. So those essays, we're going to go dig into them deeply the second half of the talk, but I want to start you off on 2 quotes, just to give you a sense of what we were getting. So a student in Toronto wrote, "My Ukrainian culture defines me. Without my Ukrainian customs, beliefs, and traditions, I think I would feel out of place in today's multicultural and ever-growing society." A Neuchatel student wrote, "As soon as we talk about a person who does not live completely like us, who has a different lifestyle than ours, we will say that they are from a different culture." So what you immediately see is that these quotes, which are somewhat representative of the two for each site, reflect a stark difference. The focus of what culture means is on us, my culture, my Ukrainian culture. The focus for the Neuchatel students is on a them. These statements raise a number of questions. How come that in Toronto, students use culture to label the self and to indicate positive feelings of belonging and diversity, while in Neuchatel, culture is used to describe others, often in a negative way? And what does this tell us about what they understand by culture? Put differently, and this is what we're really scrutinizing in the article we're presenting today, what work is the idea of culture doing in the two contexts, and how does this work relate to power? How do workings of power become visible and invisible through these uses of culture? So I want to present you our argument in a nutshell to orient you somewhat. So there's, of course, a wide body of work that has shown the instrumentalization of culture in the realm of migration. Many scholars have pointed out that a particular idea of culture, one which is rather outdated in the social sciences, has become an established part of everyday life and politics in migration societies over the past decades. This everyday bounded idea of culture delineates ethno-national groups based on an allegedly discrete set of what appear to be natural characteristics. And we call this bounded idea of culture, culture as defining attributes. Particularly popular in public discussions of migration, the assumed different culture of migrants became not only an explanatory force to justify inequalities and anti-immigration policies, but also an important tool in integration policies and politics and multiculturalism. And as Verena Stolka argued in a much-read article published in 1995, talking about culture already had at that time turned into a new rhetoric of exclusion in Europe, and that has only continued, I would argue. At the same time, culture can also invoke a rhetoric of inclusion, particularly in the US, Australia, and Canada, where it gets tied to particular uses of the term multiculturalism. Yet, we argue in this article that current academic work, which analyzes these processes, lacks a nuanced analysis of the work this idea of culture does, beyond accepting its potential for in and exclusion. What we miss is a fine-grained tracing of how people use culture as defining attribute to make sense of the world, and how this usage is then enmeshed with power. Based on an analysis of 125 essays written by students in Toronto and Neuchâtel, we then aim to demonstrate that culture as defined attribute is not only used to create differences in hierarchies, which is already established in existing work, but that specific uses of this idea of culture result in an invisibilization of particular power relations. And as we will show, this unfolds differently in the two contexts that we studied. So I want to give you a brief overview of what we're going to do in the rest of our time before handing the floor to Janine. Janine will give an overview of the literature on culture and migration and present our analytical framework. I will then turn to the methodology and present our case studies, first focusing on similarities between the two cases and then discussing the Toronto case. Janine will then talk us through what we found in Neuchatel before presenting brief conclusions, and we'll open the floor to discussion. So Janine, it's yours.
Oh, sorry, I didn't find the button how to be able to speak. I also from my side, and I just take over from Anna, but just wanted to say that it's really nice being here, even though it would of course have been nicer to be on site. But nevertheless, let's delve into this literature on culture and migration. And I will present you a very brief overview on this literature and also try to show some nuances we think that we might can add actually to this body of work. So as you know, it was mainly during the 1990s that actually we saw a kind of dramatic increase in scholarly publications discussing this concept of culture. And at the core of the debate was a critique by scholars regarding the way culture started to be used outside of academia. In fact, social scientists became concerned with the incredible success of a particular essentialist idea of culture in public and political fields. And of course, within social science, the concept of culture had been considerably revised since the 1970s and was now broadly understood as an everyday practice of meaning making. However, scholars became worried as an old-fashioned understanding of culture became prominent in political fields. So culture was now understood outside academia in terms of, and I quote here Ralph Grillo, a conception of human beings as bearers of a culture located within a nationally bounded world, which defines them and differentiates them from each other. So what we could observe was that politicians, journalists, migrants, minorities, and majorities started to use this idea of culture in order to describe not only their own belonging, their own behavior, lifestyles, identities, but also that of other people and groups, as many scholars have shown. And this idea of culture, which we will be labeling in the following, culture as defining attribute. So it's a kind of reified and bounded understanding of culture that delineates groups and mostly along ethnic, national, or racialized lines based on a discrete set of naturalized characteristics. And I will refer to this culture as defining attribute because it's very long in the following at times as CADA, and actually it was a reviewer who brought this idea up, and I allow myself to use this, and many thanks to this reviewer. Well, particularly silent for us, versions of this CADA became very prominent in the field of migration policy and actually to be used by many actors for claim making. On the political left, this idea of culture was mobilized to reivindicate models of multiculturalism and of cultural diversity. And here, culture was normatively charged as good and positive. So having a culture and being able to express one's own culture were framed in terms of a fundamental right and linked to claims of tolerance towards and recognition of other cultures. And group rights based on culture became almost a form of social justice as theorized, for instance, by Charles Taylor or Axel Honneth. On the political right, however, culture was normatively negatively charged in order to mainly take an anti-immigration or anti-immigrant stance. Right-wing politics postulated that conflicts between cultures would be natural, and the idea of incompatible cultures gained in prominence, as you all know. Yet, as different as the objective of these political claims were, they were often anchored in a very similar idea, namely in this idea of culture as defining attribute. So this form of culture appears like an essential baggage, a second skin, which people have during their lifetime. And the world was then described as a mosaic of different, often territorially demarcated, ethnic national cultures, reproducing the logic of the nation state on a global level, while migration societies, majorities or minorities, each had their own culture defined by an allegedly natural solidarity and close-knit networks. And it was exactly this idea of culture which triggered a broad range of scholarly discussions. Of course, scholars of ethnicity questioned this idea of culture, where ethnic, national, and sometimes also religious groups are treated as total social phenomena. They reject the idea that boundaries of culture, identity, community would automatically be the same, and that cultural boundaries could be explained in a quasi-natural way from one ethno-national cultural system to another. These scholars, it's given since the ground touring without being causally linked to the cultural content of these groups. So ethnicity approaches are therefore rather interested in how what Frederick Barth called cultural stuff is used by people to mark these boundaries, and in the due course of categorization, scrutinized the positively charged idea of culture as we found it in multiculturalism. And here the critique targeted mainly the downside of culture as defining attribute in terms of creating new forms of exclusion. I mean, here the work of Stephen and Felix could be mentioned. Or Aldana Lentin, for example, identified a shift from race to culture, positive celebrating of difference. Yet she argues that culturalist approaches cannot count actively, and that this resulted in a depoliticization of anti-racism, hence rendering it impossible to fight against particular forms of exclusion. In view of showing the exclusionary effects of this idea is also the work of gender culture as defining attribute became responsible for particular gender relations in contemporary politics. Across the political spectrum, actors position gender equality and women's rights as accomplished fact in Western countries, directly result from the liberal, so-called liberal cultures, and others are defined through their culture's presumed incompatibility with gender equality and respect for human rights as threatening and illiberal. And here, one of the most prominent work is probably Sarah Ferry's book on femonationalism. But also critical race and post-colonial perspective contributed to the critiques of these uses of culture. They traced the historical legacies of this idea of culture and its mobilization to label migrants as others. This work argues that such essentialized understanding of cultures are entangled with biological races, historically justified colonial exploitation. And they argue that this historical legacy is expressed in contemporary Orientalist representations about Western cultural superiority. Maybe just to mention the new book of Meiblin and Turner, or also, of course, the book of Bonilla Silva, who we think are part of this kind of arguments. Yet it must also be said that a part of migration studies continue to rely on a version of culture as defined attribute to investigate so-called either American immigrant assimilation or European integration theories. And of course, there are some differences and strong differences between US and European scholarship, yet this work often share a reliance on culture as defining attribute. Both link culture quite tightly to ethnicity, religion, and intergenerational reproduction, and particularly in the US, reflected by race. And scholars also criticize this work. We can think of Andreas Wimmer, who actually brought up that this would be a kind of Herderian view on society, or also more recently, Adrian Favel. So altogether, this scholarly work and many others, I mean, I could give you very a broad picture, outlines in detail that culture as attribute became an important element in politics in excluding people. Yet, despite the merits of this work, we argue that it has actually maybe two shortcomings. Okay. So first, most of this work focuses on politics or on different political fields to show how culture is mobilized to exclude migrants. In contrast, we are interested in our article in what we call ordinary positioned people, their uses of culture as defining attribute and the consequences in terms of power. So we want to set out when and where this idea of culture is used by people who are not positioned as politicians or street-level bureaucrats, etc. Second, this existing work has its merit in outlining that culture is indeed mobilized to foster complex exclusions in contemporary migration societies, yet we argue that what we miss is a kind of nuanced analysis of the exact work of culture beyond accepting existence. And I think we think it's quite interesting because there exist many studies investigating the way people use or do ethnicity or how ethnically framed worldviews are produced, like John Fox, you did with your colleagues in this special issue, but there is much less work which is interested in how culture is used for conditions of highly ethnicized migration context. So in order to answer these questions, we tried to develop an analytical approach which would give us the theoretical tools actually to do so. And I will very shortly present our ideas about how we actually conceptualized our work. So to start with, we distinguish, as it is quite often the case, I think nowadays in scholarly work, between empirical phenomena and our analytical toolkit. So what we propose is to treat the uses of culture as defined attribute as our empirical phenomenon and object of study. So as a kind of category of practice, it's our empirical material. Because this opens up, as we argue, the possibility to ask what people are doing when mobilizing this idea of culture. And from this angle, we can study the micropolitics of culture and its uses by people in making sense of and in the world. Second, we aim at unraveling the consequences of these uses. Objective, our analytical framework is embedded in three theoretical traditions. So first, we draw on traditions which understand cultural and heuristic terms as meaning making. So culture is the way people interpret the world around them and which allows them to act in the world. And in line with Stuart Hall, we assume that meaning making always in turn generates hierarchies of difference that produce a given symbolic order, which then structures society. Second, we turn to theorizing that understand meaning making as an empirical practice in which people draw on repertoires of meaning to interpret and motivate action. In these repertoires of meaning, culture is linked to a series of other concepts or ideas. So the work of culture can then be captured by noting what other concepts or ideas are called for. And the resulting repertoire are schools, relational, contested, and also deeply anchored in local, but also transnational historical context. And finally, we see these repertoires as fundamentally discursive in a Foucauldian sense, where language as practice is implicated with knowledge production and embedded in power. So as you know, for Foucault, power is productive and not simply repressive, and it operates at the most micro level of social relations. And this framework, we think, implicates actually that researchers need to be deeply familiar with the context that inform these discursive repertoires of meaning. And in the field of migration studies, and when it comes to the use of culture as we are interested in, this pertains, for instance, to differences in naturalization and citizen regimes, border regimes, colonial legacies, but also ways of nation-state building. And of course, and we will see this later, these are quite different in the two contexts where we did research. And I pass over to Anna. She will talk a little bit about methodology and introduce the case studies. Are you here, Anna?
Janine was just saying that we already got out of practice, and I think I was not clicking on the microphone icon, which I know so well sits on the left lower corner. So thank you so much, Janine, for outlining that our sort of theoretical roots and antecedents and how we then turn it into an analytical framework. So methodologically speaking, do you want to click to the next slide? Is there a methodology slide? Yeah, simple. As I mentioned before, the data we use come from students in Toronto and Neuchâtel. In 2020, we started each of our respective courses by asking the students to write a brief essay answering the following questions. What does culture mean to you? And can you give an example of what it means from your everyday life, such as discussion with friends or family members in political or media debates, etc. We asked the students to do this after the introductory class session, but before we started actually teaching, so before they had been exposed to all that we meant to teach about culture. And thus these essays reflect the students' interpretations of culture and what it brings up in terms of other topics. And these interpretations are based on their prior studies as well as their everyday life experiences. In terms of the sample, the Toronto students are largely fourth-year students, 43 of them, in sociology or criminology, law and society at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. It's one of the larger suburbs where there is a suburban campus with 15,000 undergraduate students, and we call it UTM for short, and I will use that. I'm likely to reference to these students as UTM students at some point. The group is quite diverse, and from the essays we learned that all of the students were either first or second generation immigrants to Canada. They are also a racially and ethnically diverse group, reflecting that the Greater Toronto area is over 50% BIPOC. So white is the plurality, but not the majority in our everyday social context. Most Neuchatel students are in their second year of study, enrolled in a bachelor in social sciences, including social anthropology, sociology, and geography. And the essays suggest that roughly half of the students indicate that they have a so-called background. We received ethics approval for using these essays, and we did not begin to analysis until after the courses had ended and final marks had been uploaded. We also anonymized the essays and do not know the names of the students, don't also know their gender, and that's kind of an interesting thing for me as a gender scholar. And all identifying characteristics mentioned in the findings derive from the information in the essays themselves. As Janine already explained, we analyze these essays for meanings and uses of culture, drawing from discourse analysis and building on inductive interpretation of texts as objects in and of themselves, and then drawing from Wodak and Myers, amongst others. And then before I will go into the actual discussion of the findings, I want to be clear that we're not aiming to do a comparative analysis. We're not going in Switzerland, this, Canada, that. We're seeing this as two cases embedded in a particular local national context, which is important for the interpretation. But we don't see this as a reflection of an entire nation state or indeed larger social categories. It's just two small groups that give us insight in how culture can be mobilized. And from that, we draw larger implications. So turning to the findings, common grounds in uses of CADA, culture as defining attribute. Analyzing the data from both research sites, it quickly became clear to us that the students overlap in their uses of culture as defining attribute. They all use culture to define a recognizable, bounded membership group rooted in shared practices, beliefs, norms, and values. And both UTM and Neuchatel students, with very rare exceptions, start their essays by giving us such a bounded idea of culture associated with particular social groups. One UTM student wrote, "When I think about culture, I think about a group of people that share the same or very similar customs, beliefs, and traditions. Oftentimes we use this term to speak about the differences between ethnic or racial groups." Neuchatel student had similar definitions. For example, this one: "I understand culture as a set of traits and characteristics, language, way of life and thought, customs, traditions, musical tastes, etc., shared by a relatively large number of individuals in a defined territory, which allows cohesion and understanding within the community." Students mobilize, looking at the right page here. Students mobilize this approach to articulate how food, music, values, and practices appear as main markers of how to distinguish cultures and their boundaries. Furthermore, both UTM and Neuchatel students deploy the idea of quote unquote origin to link culture to mostly nationally bounded territories. UTM students narrate their definition of culture through accounts of being, among others, of Italian, Portuguese, Venezuelan, Colombian, Punjabi, Pakistani, Iranian, Filipino, Caribbean, Nigerian, or Middle Eastern descent. While Neuchatel students simply link the idea of country of origin to culture. In other words, both UTM and Neuchatel students use culture as defining attribute, referring to culture in ways that reflect literature on culture from the 1990s onward. Our analysis shows a clear persistence of this common sense use of culture as defining attribute. Yet, it would be too simple to think that the students in Toronto and Neuchâtel only reproduce what we know from the literature. Rather, the students' writings reveal that as they draw on culture to define who they are, the work culture as a concept does is fundamentally different in these two contexts. So turning to the UTM students. And here we see what we call embracing positive culture as attribute through multicultural diversity. UTM students describe culture as something positively charged, a locus of belonging, affirmation of identity, sense of membership. Their essays demonstrate that these students use culture as defining attribute to demarcate differences, but without a negative judgment. Rather, the essays reflect comfort and pride in their articulations of self and of belonging. In doing so, they foreground a Canadian version of multiculturalism based on tolerance and respect for other cultures, emphasizing an absence of conflict and centering a sense of conviviality. Now, we'll get to the critique. So just hold your judgment. Canada is not this multicultural paradise. It's not what I'm trying to say. But they use these common sense understandings of multiculturalism as conviviality, respect for other cultures, and so on. And that's what we want to draw out. Indeed, we argue that this emphasis on this particular interpretation of multiculturalism can be understood as a form of hypervisibilization. And we add the prefix hyper there to signal that this form of visibilization simultaneously makes invisible other forces at play. It is as if certain elements of the discursive repertoire have been marked with a highlighter to push them to the foreground of discursive meaning construction as related to culture. Hypervisibilization of multicultural conviviality, as we call it, comes to the fore in quotes like the following. One basic tenet of culture that I've personally experienced in Canada is the basic principle of acceptance. I've noticed that majority of people are very friendly and accepting of diversity. Instead of dividing the society, we embrace each other and our differences. Students elaborate on such sentiments by tying their membership in an ethnic group explicitly to the Canadian multicultural definition of belonging. One student makes the argument that acceptance of diversity generates a sense of well-being and security, writing, and I quote, "My culture makes me feel safe and comfortable," end quote. At the same time, culture's defining attribute works to make invisible potential conflict that could result from difference. Following Stuart Hall, we might say that these students work hard to describe a world in which difference never transforms into hierarchy. This hypervisibilization of non-hierarchical difference allows a number of students to articulate a fluency of operating within and between groups, of belonging to multiple cultures fostered by this approach to diversity. One student, for instance, takes this sense of fluency to describe how Toronto not only reflects the meeting place of different quote-unquote cultures, defined in reference to ethnic origin, but also to the mutual learning of culture as defining attribute that can occur in this context. I'm going to read you a larger quote that I thought was that we both felt was quite striking. Culture in Canada is very diverse because we're a country of immigrants and we bring our cultures and share them with others in our society. I myself am a Nigerian who has also lived in South Africa, and I've learned different aspects of interactions with people. Toronto is a perfect example of how cultures are diverse and how individuals share their culture while learning and adopting aspects of other people's cultures as well. As an example from my own personal experience, I find people around my age group who are Jamaican use the Muslim phrase wallahi to swear, while Muslims will use the Jamaican phrase wagwan to greet people. I myself have also incorporated Jamaican slang since I grew up with a lot of Jamaican friends. So this student references a series of predominantly Black communities, Nigerian, South African, Jamaican, as well as Muslim communities, as having discrete cultures without any reflection in the further part of their essay on the racism faced by these communities in the Canadian context. We argue that the prominence of Canadian multiculturalism in the discursive repertoire that the students draws from when articulating the meaning of culture enables the idea of non-hierarchical belonging. Across the essays, such articulations hypervisibilize a positive locus of belonging, safety, affirmation of identity, and sense of membership, resulting in a discursive repertoire organized by notions of a non-hierarchical difference. These essays then reinforce that acceptance of group-based difference and support for conviviality permeate Canadian. And it's actually a finding that's also present in the literature on how many people mobilize multiculturalism. What we see is that the resulting discursive repertoire creates the following equivalency chain, in which race and ethnicity equals diversity equals something positive. This chain structures students' essays. In general, the almost celebratory ease with which students describe the particularities of their own ethnic culture and the joy of learning that of others suggests that this idea of multiculturalism works to make hypervisible a sense of happy togetherness and difference. At the same time, this approach to culture enables the invisibilization of racial conflict, as I already mentioned. We know from existing literature that Canadian labor market outcomes, over-policing and police brutality, and negative healthcare practices, to name a few areas of social life in which the disadvantages of race are clearly demonstrated. Such structural forces cannot be recognized in a discursive repertoire that links difference to an absence of hierarchy. The ways the students use culture also shades into defining a form of Canadian nationalism. The continuing settler colonialism that structures Canadian migration is invisibilized in this discursive repertoire, which ties culture to Canadianness and an understanding of positive diversity. Culture is also not linked to class inequalities, for example, though some mentions of class markers do come up in the essays. They are again not seen as markers of inequality, just markers of who I am. In other words, the student essay suggests that when they articulate the everyday meaning of culture, they turn towards positive diversity from racism and settler colonialism as hierarchical structural forces in Canadian society. Now, to be very clear, our argument is not that the students don't recognize or encounter racism or are unaware of settler colonialism or of class differences. For example, we know from research that we as a department conducted to better understand racial politics around Black and Indigenous students, that our students confront overt racism on a very regular basis. The issue at stake here, we argue, is that when students talk about culture, racism and other hierarchical articulations of power are not part of the discursive repertoire they draw from. To show how this works in a different way in Neuchatel, I will now turn to Janine.
Thank you. And then let me see if I manage. Oh. So we have seen, in the beginning, that the UTM and Neuchatel students, they share a kind of, they share an understanding of culture as founded, but nevertheless, what we will show now is that actually culture works very differently in the context, particularly in terms of meaning making and power. So where the Toronto students, they talk positively about themselves and their belonging to a Canadian collectivity rooted in cultural difference, Neuchatel students write mostly about others or about being othered in a negative sense when they talk about culture as defined attribute. And I remember when we have been reading these essays the first time, and then we have been really struck because it was really a kind of, the Toronto students are happy and the Neuchatel students are critical. Yet it's more complicated than this, as I will try to show you. Of course, Neuchatel is characterized by very different discursive repertoire, which is, I would say, among others, mainly related to its restrictive citizenship regime, its European context, but also a nativist understanding of belonging. I will come back later to some of these issues. However, of utmost importance in the Neuchatel context are categories like foreigners, or what is often called migration background. And these are strongly anchored in the discursive repertoire. And in this context, as we saw, migranticization is actually a dominant structuring force for the students when they talk about culture. And I put here what we mean by migranticization. It as the performative practice of ascribing migration status to people that repeatedly reproduces non-belonging, independent of whether people labeled migrants are Swiss citizens or not. So why is this important? It emerged inductively. Then we have those who do not speak about themselves being migranticized in their essays, and they tend to relegate the use of culture to other Swiss, and they heavily criticize this usage. Students, however, who write in their essay about being migranticized, they draw on definition of culture as defined attribute to fight for their inclusion. I will very shortly try to show these two different works of culture we find in the Neuchatel context. So I start with the students who reject these dominant uses of culture as defining attributes. So the students who do not bring up in the essays any migration as critical, and they really struggle with this idea of culture, and they bring up a real critical stance. One student, for instance, writes, and I quote, "I have a somewhat conflictual relationship with the notion of culture," end of quote. While another one states, "I must have been careful not to use the term culture for a year." So this is really something that's struggling, and often the students, they bring up that they want to counter the stereotyping of others that goes along with this idea of culture. This critical stance can, of course, partly be understood by the former classes where they got familiar with critiques of this form of this idea of culture. Yet we argue that there are additional facets which also play a crucial role. First, Neuchatel students' critical stance regarding this idea of culture must be understood against the backdrop of highly culturalized political debates about migration and more recently Islam in Switzerland. And the students kind of attempt to take distance from a use of culture as attribute which is charged negatively and strongly associated with the othering of migrants and the exclusionary right-wing politics. And this use of culture is also an important part of the repertoire, which includes Überfremdung, which led to regionalization. So Überfremdung was in the Swiss context originally articulated in the late 19th century, but it was reappropriated by various populist parties in the 20s and also the 21st century, often in order to limit immigration. Referendum is the fear that too much or of certain forms of immigration will compromise Switzerland's cultural identity and integrity as a nation. And the resulting discursive repertoire is also linked to a deeply nativist understanding of Swiss society. We have in German a particular term, Genosse, which conveys the idea of native Swiss. So in the imaginary, this is with common ancestry. And usually this term is reserved in the public discourse for Swiss people with no immigration in their family history ever, And it also means that even after nation, you might be Swiss, but you never can become an Eidgenosse. And students, they criticize all this issue, and particularly the critique relates to the politicization of Swiss identity. Like this student who says culture has become, or wrote, culture has become one of the most important tools for marking the boundaries between us and them in politics, and therefore, by extension, in the territory. The extremist, nationalist, and identity party brandish it to justify xenophobic measures. In Switzerland, the Swiss People's Party provides the most prominent example of a party making the question of identity a central issue. Interestingly, as this quote also shows, students relegate this reified use that migranticizes people, blaming the right-wing parties and sometimes also families and friends. As these students say, the people around me, friends or family, who are make the point of view explicit by using the notion of culture, as the culture of some people is incompatible with ours. So by relegating the use of culture, as defining attribute to other people, the students place themselves outside of a deeply anchored power structures. The students do not, most of the time, consider themselves as part of these systems of power, where culture fosters nativism and where migrantization is fundamental for the organization of Swiss society. Thus, the students engage also here in a process of invisibilization, and we argue that this one is similar to what Bonilla Silva labeled colorblind racism, but in this case, the content is different. Bonilla Silva argues that colorblind racism leads to a curious enigma of racism without racists, and in the Swiss context, only partially a racial structure, but a nativist structure which is made, and this leads to a kind of migrantization without migranticizers. I'm sorry, I know this is not elegant, but I think the idea, I hope the idea is clear, in which the students make invisible their own participation in the system, and particularly their privilege as non-migrantized people. Finally, the Neuchatel students draw on another aspect of the Swiss discursive repertoire, namely what David Theo Goldberg had labeled raceless Europe, or what Noémie Michel for the Swiss context has called racism without race. So Switzerland, like other European countries, struggles with the notion of race to a point where debates about structural racism are quite absent from public and political discourse, even though this has a little bit changed since Black Lives Matter, but it's still quite valid, I think. The notion of race is considered outdated, and in public discourse, racism is often either externalized to other countries, mainly to the US, or relegated temporarily and historically to the Shoah or to colonialism. And so it does not come as a surprise that when students talk about culture, they do not come up with the question of race or racism. However, more interesting is what the students are coming up, and they have people, students, I would say, who actually linked the question of race or racism with the notion of culture. Like this student who said, I find it, culture, to be a term that in its common usage has replaced the notion of race, but is very often used in the same way. I have often heard the derogatory way to bring a whole group of people back to their otherness with words similar to, oh, they do it like that at home. It is their culture. These students make visible that culture as attribute is linked to disuse to Swiss others. Such attempts continue to invisibilize the students' part in structural racism, as we would argue. And to finish very shortly, I would like to go to the second group which kind of emerged in the data, the struggle of the students who describe that they are kind of labeled as migrants. So first, I think it's important to say that these students, particularly those who indicate that their parents are from non-European countries, clearly describe the concrete experiences of being othered and migranticized through the deployment of culture as defining attribute. So the students indicate that they are rarely addressed as being Swiss, even when having Swiss citizenship or when born or raised in Switzerland. Instead, they are, through culture, continuously marked as to non-belonging. And this is quite the long quote again. The notions of culture has been used against me. That was the way, but it's in your culture. How are you doing it? By people who consider themselves outside of my culture and who define my culture as my ethnic and religious background. Even though I was born in Neuchatel, which is a town in the canton of Neuchatel, and have not considered to be from there. When I answer that I'm from Neuchatel, people continue and ask me, no, but basically you do not come from here, or this is because neither my first name nor my family name are familiar to them. So they are not kind of typical native Swiss names. Whether I like it or not, my actions due to my racialization are often seen as a result of my parents' culture, which by default is also mine. I have been dealing with these questions since I was a child. In other terms, what we can say as the work the culture is doing in these cases is that it hypervisibilizes people who are migrantized as non-Swiss. So it's a kind of hypervisibilization of people, even when they are Swiss citizens, in terms of othering and difference. Our analysis also reveals how students who are migrants make sense of the notion of culture themselves. What is very interesting is that they delve into the same discursive repertoire as those who are not seen as migrants, yet they use some elements differently. This means that the students mobilize the notion of culture as attribute from the position actually of non-belonging. And among others, they mainly use two strategies. So first, many students write that they do not fit into these categories of culture as defined attribute as they are assigned to. And as a consequence, the students try to find other meanings and they emphasize an individualistic part of culture. So they kind of deliberately attempt to unmark themselves from being of another culture. And this might be an example for these strategies, a student writing, my father being of Spanish and English origin, the question of culture or the idea of tracing the origin of the family are raised on a recurring basis. However, I do not identify with a Spanish or English identity. To resolve this internal conflict, I remember a few years ago having been inspired by that talk, wanting to reaffirm the origin not by the question, where are you from, but where are you local? So trying to be local, hence changing to a discursive register, which is not linked to this idea of culture, is presented here as a solution to migrantization, and it can be considered as an attempt to change the repertoire. Whether this strategy is successful is, of course, another question. Yet, this demonstrates that discursive repertoires offer elements of contestation which potentially can impact on power. Second strategy we have been able to identify is that students, they try to mark themselves with Swiss culture. And they use this idea of culture to visibilize or to attempt to visibilize their Swissness, hence again reproducing this nativist element of the available discursive repertoire. And one student expressed it like this. So it should be noted that I'm of foreign origin with two foreign parents, and I arrived in Switzerland at a very young age. So a large majority of my education and socialization was done in Switzerland. The question of being part of a different culture does not appear much in these young ages because I quickly internalized the fundamental notions and values of Swiss life and thus identify myself as a Swiss rather than a foreigner. So basically what we see here is that this idea of culture again will invisibilize systemic racism or migrantization. And of course, this strategy will be more difficult for visibly racialized students, given that they are in the nativist understanding of Swissness cast as non-belonging just because of not being white. And I will conclude. I think we talked a lot, so I will try to be short. Just 2 points maybe I would like to raise, which we also put in together with Anna in our article. So we think that our analysis leads to the conclusion that specific uses of this idea results in an invisibilization of power relations. So in other words, we argue that this missing link, visibilization, invisibilization, beyond simply showing that culture matters in terms of exclusionary or inclusionary politics. Uses of culture can diverge sharply. The 2 case studies reveal different mechanisms of invisibilization the students delve into when they use this idea of culture. What does this mean for ongoing debates on culture and migration? And we will just briefly outline one element which deals with the transnational dimension of dynamics of invisibilization of power structures. So this idea of culture has been identified by scholars as a mean of exclusion in migration context in many places. So it's a kind of transnational idea. You all know this literature. It's at least in Europe, and I think also in the US and in Canada, we have this literature. Yes, we argue that we need to conduct situated case studies. The work of culture can, in our eyes, only be fully understood when scholars are deeply familiarized with specific contexts, considering how discursive repertoires of meaning differ between contexts. Categories work different in different places. And the inclusion of these 2 case studies revealed 2 different mechanisms of invisibilization. And we think that there probably are many others. And to bring them to light could be an important step, a small one maybe, in order to tackle exclusionary power relations in contemporary migration contexts. Thank you for your attention. And I think I will stop sharing, see someone and stop talking to a woman.
Thank you so much, Janine and Anna. One of my microphone on. So good. We have plenty of time. We're about a half an hour for questions and feedback and comments. Yes, the floor is open. Bridget.
Hi, thanks, Janine and Anna. That was really great, really interesting. And there's lots that I want to ask you, but I'm going to have to go because I'm supposed to go now, but I couldn't resist. I wanted to ask about, I really liked the methods. I thought that was really interesting. But I was wondering if you could reflect a bit more on what they actually meant for your findings. So I was wondering, particularly since Anna, you started by talking about how you and Janine kind of differed in your conversation. And I was wondering, do you think that some of the students' essays were shaped by what they thought you wanted to hear because they were writing for their kind of professors? And yeah, if so, yeah, I just wondered if you felt that had any kind of implications, because I was struck by the fact that Janine, that when you presented sort of understandings of culture, Anna, very quickly, that seemed like Janine was kind of a bit more critical than you were. And so, some of Janine's students were more critical than yours. Was it that they kind of anticipate that they were kind of thinking about, well, what does my professor kind of expect and want to hear?
I can say something about it. I think, so for one, they didn't know me. So this was written after very first, and I don't know, Janine, you can chime in on that, but our first sessions of class are basically like, hi, here's the syllabus, any questions? Good, see you next week, do the reading, please. Oh, and by the way, write this essay, you get a point. So I don't think it was very targeted to me. And if it was targeted to me, actually, they would have been much more critical. Like what I teach them subsequently is to critique everything they wrote in their essays. So if they knew me. Now, having said that, I absolutely think they were writing these for their professor and their idea of a professor. But that anytime we communicate, we do that within the context of particular power relations. So that it happens to be that one doesn't invalidate the finding that this is, they're still drawing on the resources that they have available to articulate what they want to articulate, right? And it actually, I almost feel that it's kind of cool that we got them to articulate this in this relationship, right? I do have more power than they do in a classroom setting, right? Because I think it shows what people think others might want to hear when they have power over them, which in Canada is like, la. I mean, you know, I'm saying that that's a bit, there's more to it than that, but there is that sort of, and so I feel that do not, I actually think we do name it in the paper, and I could have named it more clearly here, but you know, we talked for 50 minutes at least, I think so. But I believe that any data we gather, qualitatively or quantitatively, is always embedded in a context that is inflected by certain expectations on both sides of the, you know, the interaction. And in this case, I think it allows us to see it reveals the pieces of the discursive repertoire that they have available when talking in that context, which is not an uncommon context for young people to talk in. So I see it as a plus, not a drawback. Janine, you want to add?
Yes, I just would like to add one aspect. Thanks, Bridget. I think that's quite the obvious question, of course. Also, you are also teaching, so makes sense. But I agree with what Anna said, and there's another element. Actually, they had to write another essay at the end of the course. And we didn't include this in our analysis because there it was the kind of, okay, I mean, there was a huge difference, not a huge, but there was a difference between the first essays and the other ones after 14 or 12 weeks of classes. And there, I think we saw what they learned or what they did hear from us during these 12 weeks. And I think this is kind of another argument to say, no, it's not about what they want us to hear. It's not just about what they think we would like them write. Because also there has been so many struggles, at least in these Neuchatel essays, they really struggled. They had all these critiques, but they simply fall back also to these common ground issues at times again and again. But it was interesting. I mean, we don't write this in the paper and we didn't talk about it, but the second essays, it would be interesting also to include them, but it was too complicated methodologically speaking, I think.
And if I may say something, you reminded me of the second essays. To be honest, they were slightly disappointing because the ones I got still had a lot of the original ways of thinking and not as much of the more critical stance that I was hoping for. I'm also noticing a question about the Ontario students, and actually I love it because we at some point the paper included a section that we had to cut for reasons of length, where I make the observation that in the Ontario school system, there's a heavy emphasis on teaching multiculturalism. And what does that mean? In first grade, they go to a neighborhood that has lots of Korean restaurants and they take pictures and they talk about how they live in a multicultural neighborhood because there are Korean restaurants. And then at some point I had interesting conversations with my students about where I was talking about this. And one student just very kind of in the middle of my lecture went, oh my God, that's why they kept asking me to bring samosas. Right, because she was South Asian, and they were like, "Oh, will you bring the samosas next time? Your mom makes delicious samosas." And she hadn't linked that to multiculturalism, but I absolutely think there's and again, that is about creating discursive repertoires that people draw from when they articulate meanings like the meaning of culture.
Okay, so you got here on this question, but Mohammed, did you want to turn your camera on or you're just say something if you'd like to comment on your point, or I can read it if you prefer me to. I mean, I know it was similar to Bridget's. I'll just read it then. What did it say? Okay, so he thinks it was answered, but yeah. Anyhow, Anna and Janine, you can look at that in the chat if you like. It's similar to Bridget's point. So I'm sorry, Huron, I don't know your name, so I'm just going by your tag there. But yes, over to you then for your question. Huron?
Okay. First of all, my real name is Linda. And the reason why I have a question is because I find it serendipitous that we were dealing here with a researcher based in Switzerland and a researcher based in Canada, because I studied in Switzerland and I've taught at the university level in Ontario here in Canada. And one of the things that struck me when I was living in Switzerland was that Switzerland was not Unitarian any more than it was here in Canada, and that you had the different communities defining themselves against the great powerful neighbors, whether they were Italy or France or Germany, in the same way that Canada defines itself against the United States. And I'm asking, and my question is, how does this play in to the understanding of one's, the national or the hegemonic national culture? There is no hegemonic national culture. When I listen to what's happening in Canada and the love of multiculturalism, what I see there is a repudiation of the melting pot ideology that was propagated in the United States, and the Canadian pride in asserting a point of difference where we are not Americans. The Swiss don't have to do that. There they have to define themselves against their neighbors. They also tend to define themselves against each other. I can remember, for example, being in the student cafeteria at the Université de Fribourg, which attracted students from basically all the cantons, and the linguistic groups would be, by and large, sitting separately. So to what extent the question is, to what extent do you think the understanding of the culture, of the national culture, is defined by the relations that the country has with its neighbors?
Shall I start, Anna? Many thanks for this question, which I think it's really important one, because I absolutely agree with you. But I share your observation that Switzerland has an identity which is defined ex negativo, kind of, when it comes to the neighbors. But this means at the same time that in order to have something common, the boundaries towards the outside are much stricter. I mean, in my eyes, this is one of the reasons why Switzerland has one of the most restrictive citizen regime, etc. Because to build a kind of Swiss commonality needs really to be more exclusive towards the outside. And second, I would like to maybe go back to what we've seen in our paper. We didn't talk about it, is that the students, they do mention that they don't believe in a Swiss identity, not just because, but also because local identities are extremely important. At the same time, they again have to take a distance, because the right-wing party in Switzerland, which has 30% of the voters, they use again a particular idea of Swissness in order to do anti-migration politics. So it's a kind of a multi-layered stance they have when it comes to Swiss culture or Swiss identity. On the one side, they see this heterogeneity and they clearly identify, well, there is no common Swiss culture, so why should there be a common Turkish culture when we don't have it? Then at the same time, they have this, they need to take this distance again, because Swiss identity politics is this right-wing party, which is extremely strong. And again, they reject this, of course. So I think it's there might be other layers, but just to mention two which I think are quite important in this regard.
In terms of Canada, I think that, I mean, I definitely have seen this when I moved to Canada from the United States, and I remember laughing with my partner over media reports on like somebody we thought was a famous US TV personality, but then read about them in the Canadian newspaper and go, and you always get the line, born in Toronto or from Barrie, Ontario or something. They always claim. Having said that, I found that in these particular essays, it was much more about the students' own varied national identifications. So what comes up is Filipino, or in my Filipino culture, in my Polish culture, we eat crackers for Christmas, and then added to that the appreciation to have the ability to articulate that without penalty. So I don't. I think it's sort of a question of understanding when we say making a plea for understanding context, what you're observing is definitely something to pay attention to. But in this particular case, the students did not particularly reference the United States. They were much more inclined to reference Canada, also then saying, which I didn't present, things like, I don't know if there is a Canadian culture, right? Maybe it's hockey. Like it was kind of like that. There wasn't a sense versus saying my Polish culture, which has these practices. And so, so that's sort of what we found.
When I look at Canada, I don't see a national identity, and I don't see a national identity purposely, because of the fact that we went through various stages in my life where we were originally part of the empire, and then we went through the bilingualism and biculturalism phase with the two founding nations. And then we progressed once the Ukrainian community in the West started complaining, we progressed to a multiculturalism model. But again, all of this is arising in the context of what's happening south of the border. These are ways of asserting Canadian difference. It's a way of preventing us from being sucked completely into the American cultural vortex. Now, the kids who are writing these essays have no knowledge of this past, and they're 17 years old. They're born in the 21st century already. But it's so interesting to read what they were writing, because my daughter, going through the school system in the 1990s, early 1990s, would have been writing pretty much the same thing that these kids are writing. So there definitely is an ideology that's being handed down to them. But now, in terms of their identity, do you really think it's an invisibilization of power relations, or is it an assertion against power relations? Because you can read this kind of ethnocultural pride as an assertiveness. It's not just an invisibilization.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to respond to that, Emma?
Well, I'm just thinking about it. I don't know that I have an answer for it. I think it's there is no reason why it isn't both. Right? So that's what I would say. I think that it's definitely, they're very, what we try to point out is that they do work with this concept. And I think that's what you're basically saying. It's as an assertion. These are assertions in that sense. So at the same time, they don't talk about certain processes that we would expect to have heard about.
Well, the one thing I find that doesn't get discussed, and is we seem to always have deferred conversations. We have a conversation about race, we have a conversation about culture, we conversation about class. If you were to ask these kids, what did they learn about class structures? What did they learn about class conflict in the course of their public school education? I have the sneaking suspicion that they'd be able to write 2 sentences or less. Okay, and that really is the conversation we should be having. Instead, we're talking about culture as if cultural recognition somehow will change the power relations in society, when the power relations are contingent upon the distribution of wealth, which we don't discuss. At least
Before
not with
sorry, yeah, thank you, Linda. Just before you respond to that, Anna and Jenny, I just want to make sure that other people don't have any questions that they're waiting for, just to give other people a chance. And I know that I'm in the queue as well, but I'll open the floor to anyone else. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask? Okay, well, there's still time, but you can raise your hand or put your question in the chat, or just kind of turn on the camera and speak up if you'd like. I just wanted to come in on a couple of questions as well. And I guess, so I think, yeah, I really enjoyed the talk and what you're doing here. I think it's really interesting. And I guess so I want to pick up on this idea about I think you've done a really brilliant job of showing how the students use culture and the kind of different ways that they use culture. I guess my kind of question with my interest in everyday life is, when do they use culture? So obviously they've been prompted, they've been asked to write an essay about culture. They've done that. They've shown a capacity for talking about culture, and they've done what they've been asked to do. But culture is a big thing. It's a part of everyday life. But I guess I would just ask you. Obviously, this goes beyond the scope of what you've done methodologically. But still, what do you think the connection is between what they're writing in their essays and how those versions of culture operate outside of the classroom in everyday life?
Shall I start, Anna? Maybe you can add something. Well, thanks a lot for this question, because I think this would be worthwhile to do a new research, actually. But what we can get, I think, because we asked them the second question now, what do you learn about culture in family, friends, etc.? And this is actually, well, again, we prompted it, but from the Neuchatel side, I mean, what really gets clear is every time used, they talk about others. And I think we started the talk like this, but this, I think this is really can be emphasized. And culture is, for the students who have this critical stance, is a source of conflict with their families and their friends, because they do not agree actually with this idea of culture as defining attribute. So I mean, we do not study interaction. We give many examples, what they heard, what happened to them, if they themselves are always kind of put into the box of being a culture, or if they bring up stories with friends and families where they had this kind of extremist view about culture. I think it's important, even though I think, as I said, we need to make another research to really see how they use it in the daily life. And it's not very satisfying, my answer, but I think it gives us some glimpses, actually, this text, this essay.
Your question makes me want to sit in the student comments and just put strategically placed microphones and just see what they're actually chatting about, and coming up with something like that, because it's hard to say. Of course, we asked them to, and but what I'm reminded of, it's the difference in the two groups of responses is that, as Janine was focusing on the Neuchatel context, conflict, there's a lot of conflict around culture. And as we know from Anne Swidler, that's when there's conflict, that's when they start to articulate and define what they mean, what a certain issue means to them. And in the Canadian case, that was less the case, which is sort of surprising, because when you look at migration politics and so forth, the kind of politics around certain communities in Canadian context, so particularly anti-Black racism and also anti-Muslim racism, particularly anti-Muslim racism in Canada also gets articulated around notions of culture. And even though on average 20% of our students are Muslim background, it didn't really come up in the essays. What came up was even about Islam, it would be that people, and here Linda's comment about the students were absolutely crafting something in that regard. They would describe how they go to Tim Hortons, wear the hijab, buy at Abercrombie and Fitch, and, you know, hang out with their friends or something like that. And they would insert this hijab mention to very much normalize that, right? Or it normalized it. I don't know, you can never really decide how deliberate people are in that. But in terms of everyday, we just, that's not something we can tell, but we have kind of puzzled over, and that's actually where we stepped away from. At some point we used the term every day, but we went to sort of people who are just everyday people when they are asked, right? We realized that we really could not speak to the interactional everyday, you know, not kind of directed the way these essays were.
Yeah, no, I mean, fair enough. I mean, that's a completely different research agenda, and
no, but
and
the question is, I think, extremely well, is an important one, actually.
Yeah, but you know, it's also, I mean, you know, I used to criticize work on national identity for asking direct questions about national identity, but I think it gets at some of the kind of taken for granted assumptions about these sorts of things that you wouldn't otherwise articulate. Because the way culture operates in everyday life, it's kind of like, you know, it's banal culture very often. I mean, it's an unspoken culture, or the version it takes is not culture with a capital C, but race, ethnicity, diversity, multiculturalism. You know, all sorts of different sort of cognate concepts that are doing the work of culture, and so it's far messier. But I think it's challenged. I think there is merit in asking people direct questions about these things, because it's kind of like a Garfinkelian breaching experiment. It requires them to kind of, you know, articulate the unarticulatable. So it asks them to kind of say things that they don't really have to think about otherwise. And so I think there is some value in doing that. But they're different agendas, yeah. And you know, I take your points, Janine, also about the kind of asking them about how it you know, operates in their lives outside of the classroom, and so you get some insight into that as well. But there's a selection bias, of course, there in the stories that they tell, and yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but of course it doesn't get nothing like a good ethnography, right? So sitting, as you said, in the student common and listening, although so much of it's unspoken, that's the problem, right? So it's not just listening, it's seeing the effects of culture rather than hearing and seeing culture itself in operation. Yeah, so all right, Linda, I interrupted you earlier. Did you want to come back on any of your earlier points?
I thought I'd spoken quite enough, and I want to thank you for your generosity in time. I mean, this has been an extremely exciting and productive and stimulating conversation, and really I could go on for an hour, so I'm going to stop now.
And I second that view as well. I have a list of questions here that I could go on with as well, but I think we should make one more opening to the floor. Does anyone else want to raise any questions before we wrap things up? If that's not the case, then let's thank Janine and Anna one more time for a really engaging talk, and also for the conversation that followed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah,
Second that.
you're very welcome.
Right.
It was lovely seeing everyone, and I have to run to get my partner at the airport, so I'm going to make a move. Sorry, but yeah, thanks again so much. And in 2 weeks' time, or about 10 days' time, we have Willem Schinkel's talk in the Ethnicity Center. That's the 23rd. You'll get the announcements for that. So hope to see some of you there as well. Take care, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.